it is a matter of accidental delay. I mean, that desire to pursue an intense educational pathway does exist in conflict, certainly with an early start to family development. If you presume that that doesn't matter because you've got time, you're not going to find out that isn't true for 10 years in your own life, and maybe the culture won't find out that's true for like 30 years. I mean, we still tell young women who are 19. I made a comment that was clipped on an Instagram reel by someone about the fact that we always lie to young women about what's going to be important in their lives. We tell them it's going to be all career. I said, I've worked in female-dominated industries my whole life, and what I've observed is, among men and women alike, that it's a very rare person for whom career is the most important thing in their life, even if they're men, although it's true for more men. It's true for virtually no women by the time they hit 30. And the amount of vitriol that comment generated was unparalleled. And that's something, because I've had plenty of vitriol generated from things I said, but it was all young women, talking about how some old white guy like me had no right to tell young women what to do with their bodies, which I most certainly was not. But it is, you can see a simple pathway there, right? It's like, well, we have this avenue where we can pursue our career and our education and everything else we want, and then we'll be able to solve the problem of having a family. The problem with that is, well, it's hard enough to find a mate when you're 23, 24. By the time you're 30, it's even more difficult. And by the time you're 35, it's starting to become well nigh impossible to find a mate and get pregnant and have a family, especially if you're going to have more than one kid. And so there's a direct conflict there between the avenues that are open to women and the need to strike while the iron's hot on the reproductive front. Nobody really knows how to reconcile that. I mean, it's odd, because women will live about 7 years longer than men. So it could be the case that the societal norm could be that women have their children when they're quite young and then go back to school in their 30s. That would actually work out. In principle, that could work out quite nicely, but we don't have the norms in place to make that a possibility. Well, 1 in 3 couples by the age of 30 have pronounced fertility problems, defined as inability to conceive within a year of embarking on the endeavor consciously, right? So that's 1 in 3. And of course, it just gets worse and worse as age creeps up. And 30 is not that old. And it does mean that women have a damn tight window. It's 13 years, let's say. By the time you're 17, by some standards, you're mature enough to consider reproduction, 17 or 18, and on the extreme end. And then, 35 is the other end of that distribution. And you're playing with fire by the time you're delaying, especially if you don't have a partner, by the time you're delaying till 35.
Especially if you want 3 children,
Yeah, well, right. I'm thinking just 1, and it's also the case. I think if you're a reasonable observer of human nature, you see that people have 3 sources of fundamental gratification in their lives. One is the pursuit of their own interests, including career and job. One is their intimate relationship, and the other is their family. And obviously, the intimate relationship and the family are very integrally associated. And if you miss out on one of those, you may be able to fill it by exceptional ability in the remaining domains. But for most people, not only is that highly unlikely, it's also highly undesirable. So,
because to take the point as well, here am I, an older male talking about things that are very sensitive to women, but there are a lot of women out there saying the exact same thing. And there was one this morning. I got an email from Melanie Nutkin, who's written a book called Otherhood, who herself has no children, and she put it succinctly that, in her words, women are going through the education path, the career path, to try to ultimately fall in love and have a family.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's all linked.
Yeah, well, I think it's the same for men.
I think so too.
It's more than that. Half the reason that men strive for career success is to impress women and attract them. In fact, it's higher than that.
But maybe that point is the heart of the problem we have today, because today, if you look at who's at college And who's actually earning more right now? I read this morning, women in cities in the US are earning more than men. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but you have this situation.
Yeah, it's right under 30. Yeah.
So in US colleges right now, there are, I believe it's 9.5 million women and around 6.57 million men.
Oh, and the women start dropping out of college, by the way, when they start to outnumber the men 2 to 1. Right? Because a lot of the reason people go to college, you got to ask yourself, what's college for? It's like, well, it's to get educated, to go to lectures, to be accredited. It's like, no, probably not. Probably the reason people go to college is to find a mate. And there's a selected pool there, and you have a decent chance of finding someone, of approximately your ability and forward-looking vision, let's say. And the reason people are willing to shell out between $150,000 and $250,000 for 4 years is in no small part so that they can find a mate. Well, and if you demolish that by, radically decreasing the number of available men, for example, you're just going to blow the whole enterprise out of the water, which is already what's happening.
And absolutely. And this is perhaps my greatest concern, because I think if we make young people more aware of the fertility window, they might want to have children earlier. If we link that to in some way enabling careers later in life, which has to fundamentally happen for this to work, we might still be left with a situation where women who, the term is hypergamy, where women typically want to marry someone at least as educated, at least as successful, taller than they are. But if we're in a situation where there's so few men getting the same level of education, we might be left with this imbalance.
Oh yeah, so that's already happening, clearly. Yeah, it's very difficult for women to overcome the hypergamous instinct because they're trying to redress the imbalance in terms of reproductive responsibility. And there's no evidence at all. You get a little bit of flattening of hypergamy in extremely egalitarian societies like Scandinavia, but it certainly doesn't disappear. And so that's built in at a very fundamental biological level. And I don't think any casual tinkering on the anthropological or sociological front is going to shift that a bit. So that's a big problem.
It's a big problem.
It's also the case, too, that if marriages where the wife out-earns or out-statuses the husband tend to be comparatively unstable and violent. So, now you can lay that at the feet of the men if you're inclined to, but in some sense it doesn't really matter because that's the way it is. And so the women are unhappy and the men are threatened, and that's just not a good recipe for marital stability.
So everyone loses in this situation. So let's talk about another country, Thailand. So you would think, if you'd asked me how many women are in college in Thailand, I might have said 15%. I have no idea, but no, it's 55%. 40% of men are in college in Thailand. So you have a similar shift even there. And what's happening to the men? The documentary, we went to a temple where monks are trying to rehabilitate young men who fell out of college or didn't go to college, moreover. What they did, age 16, 18, was turn to alcohol, was turn to substances, to drive taxis because they could get some cash, because there was no point trying to compete with a woman. So you have these deep societal problems, but yet I want to be really clear that the answer to this is not in some way preventing women from getting an education. That's just not going to function. How are you going to do that?
You also lose access to half the world's brain power.
Of course. And, there are people who think that, and there are people who I think want to use this conversation to promote that, because I've seen comments along those lines too often. This has to be, therefore, partly about men in some way, asking why are men excluded from society? Why are they becoming incels? Or in Japan, they call them otakus, the young man who stays home playing his gaming systems. And
I don't think that's the right question. I think we almost always ask questions backwards. Why people become useless, that's not a mystery. It's easy to be useless. The mystery is why that doesn't happen to everyone all the time. And the answer is because we build up extremely careful structures of societal discipline to encourage people to adopt mature long-term responsibility and to reward them judiciously for doing so. And when you allow those structures to collapse or work consciously to undermine them, then you get default to the default. And the default is useless. It's short-term gratification. And so you never need an explanation for that. It's like, well, why do people turn to short-term gratification? Because it's gratifying in the short term. It's easy. Now, encouraging men to shed their Peter Pan persona, juvenile Peter Pan persona, and to adopt mature responsibility, that's a real challenge for every society. And we are increasingly not only failing at doing that, but punishing young men for developing, say, the virtues of ambition and even sexual desire, for that matter.